Amelia Grant discovered the plan to sell her studio at 5:42 in the morning, while Seattle was still covered in a wet grayness, the kind of sky that did not look like dawn but like a long night refusing to end. Her apartment was so quiet she could hear the soft hum of the heater inside the wall, the steady tapping of rain against the living room window, the water in the electric kettle beginning to boil, and then clicking itself off, leaving behind a silence that made every object in the apartment seem to be holding its breath with her. Lucas Bennett was still asleep in the bedroom, or at least that was what she thought, because his gray sweater was still draped over the back of the dining chair. His old leather shoes were by the door in the way of a man who never lined things up perfectly but never truly left them messy either. And his laptop was open on the table, the screen glowing blue in the unlit kitchen. Amelia had woken early because he had a flight to New York at noon, and she had meant to make coffee for him, a small gesture she had once believed was mature love. No loud promises, just remembering that the man she loved drank black coffee but liked it cooled for 3 minutes. Remembering that he often forgot to eat before flights, remembering to slip a few protein bars into his camera bag, even though he always insisted he did not need them. She walked past the dining table, intending only to glance at the screen and shut it for him. But the title of the PDF file left open there stopped her hand in midair. New York Transition Plan. Beneath it was a timeline so beautifully organized it felt terrifying, divided by month, task, and feasibility status. January, discuss relocation with Amelia. February to March, assess Grant House Studios valuation, find a partner to absorb current clients, speak with Maya about the possibility of taking over if properly trained. April, notify key clients, terminate or transfer the studio lease. May, prepare to sell Amelia's Seattle apartment or rent it out. June, move to Brooklyn and establish an online design consulting model. And there, among those clean lines of text, like a blade tucked inside white paper, was one short note. Amelia needs 6 months to emotionally detach from Grant House Studio. She read that sentence once, then again, so slowly that each word seemed to separate from the others and stand up on its own in the cold kitchen. Emotionally detached, as if the studio were a piece of furniture she had grown too attached to, a rental room she was irrationally sentimental about, a professional habit that needed to be managed through a transition schedule. Not the place she had first opened with both hands shaking, not the sign bearing her name that she had hung herself after 10 years of living like someone always begging for a little more time, not the 3 people whose salaries depended on her, not the clients who trusted her, because she did not treat their small homes like second-tier projects, not the only proof that after all the years of her father's death, her mother's illness, student debt, and an old sofa, Amelia Grant had finally earned a door with her own name on it. She did not scream. It was not the kind of pain that made a person scream right away. It arrived slowly, coldly, precisely, like rainwater soaking through a coat you had believed was still dry. Amelia sat down at the kitchen chair, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, her hand resting beside the coffee she had not yet made, her eyes fixed on the screen. She scrolled down through the file, and the more she read, the more she felt something inside her being unscrewed piece by piece. Lucas had written about her mother, Ruth, under family support. Local care can be arranged. Ruth Grant, the 67-year-old woman with a mild heart condition, the woman who had worked 2 cashier shifts a day to pay for medication after Amelia's father died. The woman who had told her when she was 21 never to depend on any man unless she had a key of her own, now existed in Lucas's plan as a logistical item. Maya was mentioned as an employee who could be trained to maintain partial operations during the transition period. The 3 years remaining on the studio lease were marked as financial obstacle but negotiable. The business loan that was nearly paid off was called manageable debt. Her apartment, the one whose window looked down on a rainy street and whose wooden table she had bought with her first month's salary after the studio became profitable, was listed as an asset to liquidate or rent. Her life had been translated into the language of relocation. Things made of blood, sweat, shame, pride, and memory had become assets, obstacles, arrangements, transition. Lucas was not clumsy. He was not careless in an obvious way. The file was elegant, intelligent, orderly, even containing links to Brooklyn apartments marked with small comments. Good light for Amelia, close to subway, suitable for work corner. That carefulness made it more brutal. He had not forgotten her. He had thought about her a great deal. It was just that in all those thoughts, he had imagined an Amelia who could be detached from her own life, folded up, placed into his suitcase, and opened again in another city without losing her shape. Behind her, the bedroom door opened. Lucas stepped out in a white t-shirt, his hair messy, his face still heavy with sleep. He stopped when he saw her in front of the laptop. For one very brief second, Amelia waited for him to panic, to hurry toward the computer, to understand that he had been caught doing something wrong. But Lucas only stood there in silence, then exhaled very softly. "I was going to talk to you about it tonight," he said. "Not, I'm sorry I planned your life without you. Not, I shouldn't have written about your mother that way." Only that he had been planning to talk about it tonight, as if the problem was when she saw it, not that it existed. To understand why that sentence chilled Amelia to the bone, one would have to go very far back, to a tiny rented apartment where she once slept on an old sofa because the bedroom had been given to Ruth after her second hospital discharge, to the nights when she freelanced until 2 in the morning and went to work at a design firm at 8, her eyes burning from lack of sleep, but still lined with eyeliner, so no one could see she was collapsing. Her father had died when she was 19, suddenly from a heart attack, leaving behind not only an empty place at the dinner table but medical debt, unfinished tuition, a mother growing thinner inside fear, and a daughter who suddenly understood that youth could end without asking permission. Amelia studied interior design through scholarships, loans, weekend waitressing shifts, and small rendering jobs for clients too insignificant for larger studios to call back. She had once worked at a well-known Seattle design firm where people praised her for having a good eye, but never gave her major projects to lead, where one of her ideas for apartments designed for older adults was carried into a presentation by her superior without her name attached. And when she objected, a male director told her, "You, Ray, good with details, Amelia, but leadership requires a different kind of nerve." She quit 3 months later, not in a grand, triumphant scene, but after an evening spent standing in the company bathroom, looking at her shaking hands after receiving an email asking her to revise the very idea that had been stolen from her, and understanding that if she stayed, she would slowly begin to believe they were right. Grant House Studio began in a small space on a side street, with a low ceiling, scratched wooden floors, and a heating system so bad that during their first winter, she and Maya had to work in their coats. She painted the walls a warm white herself because she could not afford painters, installed shelves from discounted lumber, and mopped the floors at 2 in the morning before opening day. While Maya Chen, then 26, not yet a mother, freshly burned out from a large firm, stood on a ladder holding the Grant House Studio sign against the glass door, tightening screws and laughing, "If it falls, we'll call it installation art." Only 7 people came on opening day, including 2 who had walked in by mistake thinking it was a furniture shop. But Amelia stood behind the little counter, both hands wrapped around cheap coffee, looking at her name on the glass and thinking, with frightening clarity, that no matter what happened, at least this place was hers. No one could sigh and tell her she was too sensitive. No one could take her idea and call it their own leadership. No one could tell her she did not have what it took to lead when the key was in her hand. The early years had no glamour. There were electric bills that arrived before clients paid, nights when she ate crackers for dinner because the cash had to be saved for payroll, times when Ruth called near midnight with mild chest pain, and Amelia drove through the rain to reach her, then returned to the studio at 3 in the morning to finish a material board for a client. There were wealthy clients who looked at her like a young woman trying too hard to seem professional and asked whether the real person in charge could join the meeting. And Amelia would smile and say that person was already sitting in front of them. There were smaller clients who brought children, anxiety, tight budgets, and she learned to create beauty not through expensive things, but through precise care. A lower door handle for a mother with arthritis, flooring that would not slip under a child's running feet, a dining corner that caught afternoon light so a single father could have. Ila's home still had a place to sit down. The studio was not only where she made money, it was where she turned old instability into structure. It was where she, a woman who had once been pushed by life from one bill to the next, could finally schedule appointments, sign contracts, unlock a door every morning, and know that today she belonged somewhere. Lucas appeared years later, when Grant House Studio had survived its near-death stage, but was not yet large enough to be called safe. At a community photography exhibition in an old warehouse renovated near the Seattle waterfront, Amelia had designed the space for the exhibition, built raw wooden partitions, and chosen low lighting so the black and white photographs of immigrant workers would not become clean decorative conscience for wealthy people drinking wine. Lucas was the main photographer, known just enough in the documentary world, having done projects about homelessness, forgotten towns, and migrant families living among paperwork no one had fully read. He was not like the men Amelia often met in design, the kind who spoke about space, as though they were speaking about personal branding. Lucas owned few things, wore his shirt sleeves rolled up, carried an old camera against his chest, and looked for a long time without intruding. He stood beside her while she adjusted a spotlight, studied the room, and said, "You don't design rooms. You design places where people are allowed to lower their shoulders." Amelia remembered laughing because the sentence sounded almost too right, too beautiful, too dangerous. But he did not say it like he was trying to flatter her. He saw the chairs she had placed slightly off the central axis, so viewers would not stand in a museum-like line, saw the walkway wide enough for wheelchairs, saw the light that did not strike the faces in the photographs too harshly, and he understood. That was what drew her in. Lucas saw the meaning in her work, not just the paint colors, chairs, and lighting. They met again after the exhibition and went to photograph sunrise at the harbor on a cold morning that smelled of salt, engine oil, and coffee from an early opening cafe. He photographed the light on the water while she stood beside him, hands in her coat pockets, listening to gulls cry and telling him a little about her father, her mother, and the years when she feared she would never have a place to stand. Lucas told her he had once left a stable job at a major magazine because he felt himself dying inside meaningless editorial calendar. "I hate the feeling of being tied to a place just because it's safe," he said. Amelia looked at the gray-blue water and answered, "I once lived like I had nothing to keep, so now having something to keep feels like a miracle." Lucas smiled, then kissed her for the first time under a cold light that made everything look more honest than romantic. She thought perhaps she had met a man who could love her strength without needing to take it from her. She did not realize they had spoken the largest difference between them that very morning. For Lucas, freedom meant leaving when a place began to feel small. For Amelia, freedom meant finally being able to stay somewhere she had chosen, without being driven out by debt, illness, men, or fear. The first months were beautiful, because love had not yet been asked to pay for anything big. Lucas came to the studio to photograph finished projects for her portfolio, while Amelia sat on the floor of his minimalist rental apartment, helping him arrange photographs for a grant submission. He softened her in ways she had not known she needed. He shut off email on her phone at 9 at night, turned it face down on the table, and said, "No one dies because a tile color gets chosen tomorrow morning." He pulled her out of the studio on Sundays and took her to eat at a small place by the water, where she did not have to check supplier invoices between the entree and dessert. He photographed her when she did not know it, bending down to tie her shoe or standing in the rain in front of a closed tile shop. And in his photographs, she always looked less rigid, like a woman being allowed not to manage everything. She loved him for that. Lucas loved her too, truly, in the way a man accustomed to traveling light suddenly becomes fascinated by a woman with roots. He loved her studio when it was a place he visited, loved watching Maya argue with her about upholstery fabric, loved hearing clients call to thank her because a new kitchen had helped their elderly mother stop tripping over the threshold. But at that point, he had not yet had to be responsible for the entire system of that life. When her mother was hospitalized for a heart check on a weekend they had planned to drive to the coast, Lucas did not get angry. He even sat in the waiting room with her for 2 hours, bought her hot tea, and held her coat. But on the way home, he said very quietly, "You always live as if there's a list of things you have to save." Amelia heard that and felt both seen and judged. Maybe it was true. She did have a list. Ruth needed medication. Maya needed her paycheck on time. Client needed a doorway resized for his daughter's wheelchair. The studio lease required insurance renewal. But that was not just a list. It was her life, the ties she had chosen, the system that had kept her from drifting away. Lucas saw ties and thought of restraint. Amelia saw ties and thought of the reason she was still standing. When the New York email arrived, she was genuinely happy for him. They were in Lucas's apartment, rain tapping softly against the window, 2 glasses of red wine on the low table, his camera lying beside the open laptop. A major media organization was inviting him to become creative director for a 2-year documentary project on cities and housing inequality. New York, larger resources, international exhibitions, a budget that his Seattle projects had never had. Lucas read the email once, then sat still, like a person afraid that touching the dream would make it disappear. Amelia hugged him before he said anything. "You deserve this," she said, and she believed it. She had watched him work himself raw for projects with little money but deep meaning, watched him sell prints to fund his own travel, watched him hide his disappointment every time a foundation rejected his application with the sentence, "important but not aligned with current priorities." She was happy for him, but happiness brought a question standing right behind it. Lucas did not let that question stand for long. He kissed her forehead, his eyes bright, and said, "We'll go, not I'll go. Not what do you think if I accept? We'll go." For a moment, the sentence glittered, like in movies where love becomes a flight route. A small Brooklyn apartment, 2 people beginning again with an old table and light through tall windows. Amelia was carried by it too, for a few minutes. She imagined New York, noisy streets, Lucas stepping out of a gallery, herself opening her laptop in a cafe, a life bolder and lighter. But when she returned to her own apartment that night, she dropped her keys into the ceramic bowl by the door, saw the studio key lying beside Ruth's house key, looked at the client calendar on the refrigerator, the payroll due on Friday, Maya's message about Theo Price's project, and New York was no longer a dream. It was a force pulling at every single thing she had spent 10 years keeping from collapsing. Lucas began sending her lists of Brooklyn apartments with little notes that made her feel both touched and unsettled. Big windows for your plants, close to the subway so you can meet clients easily, bright enough for a work corner. At dinner one night, beneath low candlelight and the sound of rain outside, he brought a notebook and said he had been thinking seriously. Amelia looked at that notebook, and something small moved inside her, like an animal in the brush hearing a branch crack. He said she could sell the studio or hand it over to Maya, shift into online consulting, freelance in New York, where the clients were bigger and the market broader. "I don't want you to give up your dream," he said, his hand on the table, his voice gentle but full of conviction. "I want you to dream bigger." Amelia looked at him. "What if my dream is already here?" Lucas smiled, a little sadly, the kind of smile he used when he thought she was trapping herself inside a small answer. "You say that because you're afraid." That sentence went straight into the wound she did not want anyone to see. Afraid. Of course she was afraid. She was afraid of debt coming back, afraid of her mother falling when no one knew, afraid of her employees losing their jobs, afraid of waking up one day in another city and realizing she had traded her name on a glass door for a drawer in the life of the man she loved. But when Lucas said, "You're afraid," it stopped being a reasonable feeling. It became evidence against her. She was afraid, therefore she was not free. She was afraid, therefore she was small. She was afraid, therefore the studio was no longer an achievement but a cage. "I'm inviting you into a bigger life," Lucas said. Amelia inhaled slowly. "Or are you telling me my life is only big enough if it sits beside yours?" For the first time in months, Lucas did not immediately have a beautiful answer. He looked down at his wine. "I can't love someone who always keeps one foot near an exit," he said at last. Amelia heard it and felt her heart contract. To him, the studio was an exit. To her, it was an entrance. It was the first place where she did not have to prepare to run. Nina Alvarez, Amelia's best friend and a contract lawyer, read everything with eyes that could not be softened by romantic language. Nina's office was small, the fluorescent light a little harsh, the desk covered with files, black coffee sitting in a mug that read "read" before signing. Amelia told her about New York and tried to say Lucas was not a bad man before Nina could judge him. Nina only nodded. "He doesn't need to be bad for you to be allowed to look at the risk." She took out a sheet of paper and asked question after question. If Amelia sold the studio, who would pay the remainder of the loan? If she broke the 3-year lease, how much would the penalty be? How would Maya and the other 2 employees be compensated? If Amelia went to New York and the relationship fell apart after a year, what would she have in her own name? How would existing clients be handled? Did Ruth have long-term care coverage? Amelia began to defend him. "Lucas isn't using me for money. He's not like that." Nina looked up. "I believe you, but good people can still ask you to pay a price they don't understand." That silenced Amelia. Nina did not hate Lucas, which made her harder to dismiss. "In his plan," Nina asked, "is there any line about what he gives up?" Amelia opened her mouth, then closed it. Lucas would leave Seattle, but that was his opportunity. He was not giving up his life. He was walking into it. She was the one being asked to dismantle hers in order to stand beside him. When Amelia hinted to Maya that New York might be possible, Maya's reaction was not immediate anger. Maya stood in the middle of the studio, one hand holding a stylus, the other gently rocking the small stroller where her daughter was asleep, her face changing like someone trying to be happy for another person while feeling the ground split beneath her feet. "I'm not telling you not to go," Maya said very slowly. "I just need to know whether we're people in your plan or furniture you'll figure out how to ship somewhere else." That hurt Amelia because it was fair. She had once hated people who could decide other people's lives through polite email. Now she was at risk of becoming one of them, in the name of love. She looked at the name on the glass door at Maya, at the baby asleep inside a studio that always smelled of new wood and coffee. And for the first time, the Grant House sign looked both like her pride and like a chain around her ankle. She hated herself for thinking the word chain. Then she hated Lucas for planting it inside her. Ruth Grant did not speak much, but when she did, she usually placed her finger directly on the bruise. Her small kitchen smelled of canned soup, mint tea, and heart medication. On the shelf was still a photograph of Amelia's father, faded at the edges, his smile younger than Amelia's final memory of him. Amelia told her mother about New York after 3 attempts not to, because she feared Ruth would see herself as a burden. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, her hands thin, her skin delicate, her eyes fixed on her daughter. "You want me to tell you to go," she said. Amelia looked down at her tea. "I don't know what I want you to say." Ruth smiled faintly, tiredly. "When I was your age, I gave up nursing school to follow your father to Spokane because he had a job there. I called it love. I thought my life would come back after he settled. Then you were born, then money was short, then your father got sick, and that course became something I mentioned like a joke at the checkout counter." Amelia looked up. "Do you regret having me?" Ruth immediately placed her hand over Amelia's. "No, don't turn my story into your wound. I do not regret you. I regret calling my own disappearance love." The kitchen fell silent. Rain tapped softly against the awning. Ruth continued, her voice small but sharp. "The man who loves you may be worth going with, but if you have to leave behind everything that keeps you standing, ask whether he loves you or the version of you that is easy to carry." When Amelia left, Ruth stood to see her to the door, then became dizzy and had to grip the edge of the table. Amelia helped her sit, her heart pounding. Ruth smiled weakly and said she had only stood too fast. But in that moment, with her mother's trembling hand inside hers, Amelia understood that responsibility was not a fake excuse. It had skin, bones, medication, midnight phone call. Lucas could call it a care arrangement in a PDF, but Ruth was not an arrangement. She was the woman who had kept Amelia alive through years, when no one else had been there. The pressure became suffocating, because Lucas never became a villain. If he had yelled, belittled her openly, betrayed her, things might have been easier. But he still brought coffee to the studio, still photographed her projects in light that made the rooms look like they had souls, still stroked her hair when she was tired, still told her he loved the resilient part of her. Then that very resilience became fear when it did not serve his direction. One rainy night in Amelia's apartment, she laid financial papers on the table and said she needed time, a real plan for the studio, her employees, her mother, her clients. Lucas stood near the window, his shadow stretching across the floor, his face both hurt and disappointed. "You built the studio to be free," he said, "but now you're using it like a cage." Amelia looked at him. "Do you hear what you're saying?" "Yes, and I know it's hard to hear, but I'm not going to pretend you aren't letting your past control you. My past is why I know how to stand." "No, your past is why you think standing means never moving." For a few seconds, she almost believed him. That was Lucas's power. He spoke in half-truths. Amelia was controlling. She was afraid of change. She did sometimes use the studio as a refuge from the kinds of wounds love could bring. But a half-truth can be more dangerous than a lie, because it makes the person hearing it complete the rest with their own guilt. She said, "You're asking me to leave concrete things for a promise." Lucas answered, "I'm asking you to believe in us. Believing in us does not have to mean I stop believing in my own life." He looked at her, his eyes darkening. "If you don't come, we're going to lose each other slowly." It was not a direct ultimatum, but it had the shape of a closing door. Amelia lay awake all night after that, listening to rain strike the glass, his words repeating in her mind. You're afraid, a cage. Believe in us. A bigger life. She wondered what it meant if the love of her life was asking her to step through her fear. Then the next morning, she went to Theo Price's house. Theo was a long-time studio client, a single father renovating an old bungalow so his 8-year-old daughter, Lily, could use her wheelchair without feeling like her own home was a maze. The house smelled of dust, old wood, and children's orange juice. Lily sat near a low window, her hair in 2 braids, a notebook covered in star stickers resting on her lap. When Amelia crouched down to the girl's level, Lily asked with great seriousness, "Can you make my room not look like a hospital?" Amelia felt her throat tight. "We're going to make it look like somewhere you want to wake up." She measured the turning space near the bed, noted the proper height for cabinet handles, checked the window lights so Lily could read without glare, and told Theo they did not need to buy everything expensive, only everything right. While she was marking the drawing with a pencil, Lucas called. "Did you look at the Brooklyn apartment email yet?" he asked. Amelia looked at Lily arguing with Maya over video call about whether the wall should be purple or ocean blue. Looked at Theo, standing in the kitchen, pretending to read an invoice, so no one would see his eyes were wet. And for the first time understood with absolute clarity that Lucas called the studio a cage because he had never seen it. From inside the lives that leaned on it, Lily's project would not make her rich. It complicated the schedule, tightened the budget, and had a thin profit margin. But that was why Grant House Studio existed. She had not built this place to make penthouses look more expensive. She had built it so ordinary people could step into their homes without feeling that life itself was working against them. "I haven't looked yet," she told Lucas. He went silent for a beat. "Amelia, we can't keep delaying." She looked at the drawing with a handwritten note, space to turn chair near window. "I know," she said, but for the first time, it did not mean she would run after him. Dinner with Lucas's friends in Capitol Hill made the quiet diminishment public. The restaurant was dim, the wine expensive, the laughter intellectual, the artists speaking about cities as though they had been granted the right to call some places small. Lucas's friend Marin, a photo editor, said, "You'll love New York. Seattle is sweet, but it's small." Someone else asked whether Amelia would close the shop or do hobby design there. Lucas sat beside her, smiled lightly, and said, "She's figuring out how to transition." He did not correct shop. He did not correct hobby. He did not say Grant House Studio was a company she had spent nearly 10 years building, with employees, contracts, clients, debt, and a reputation. He allowed their story to become the story of him going to New York and her figuring out how to transition. Amelia sat at the table, smiling politely enough, but inside her, the young woman whose old firm had stolen her idea and told her she lacked leadership was rising very slowly to her feet. On the drive home, rain fogged the car windows. She said, "You let them call my life a hobby." Lucas watched the road. "You're being too sensitive. They're just excited for us, or for the version of us that fits your story. You always hear other people's words as attacks, because sometimes they are attacks wrapped in wine." Lucas exhaled, tired. "I don't know how to say anything without you turning it into evidence that I don't respect you." Amelia looked at him. "Maybe you could start by respecting me when I'm not in a shape that's convenient for your life." That silenced him. But Lucas's silence did not sound like recognition. It sounded like withdrawal before preparing another argument. And that argument appeared days later as the PDF she found at 5:42 in the morning in her cold kitchen with the words, "Emotionally detach," written like a sentence in a beautiful font. Conversation after Lucas saw her reading the file did not explode. It was more frightening because it stayed so calm. He stood by the table, hands gripping the back of a chair, saying he was only trying to help them create a practical future. Amelia pointed to the screen. "You called my mother a care arrangement?" Lucas closed his eyes for a second. "That's just the language of a plan?" "No, that's how you see my life when it gets in the way of yours. You know I don't think of your mother as an item. Then why does everything that belongs to my life turn into something to be managed when you write a plan for our future? Because if I don't write it down, you'll keep saying everything is too complicated." "It's complicated because it's real life. Real life is always complicated, Amelia. People still choose." That made her laugh without humor. "Choose. You use that word as if the two choices are equal. You get to walk into the biggest opportunity of your life. I get to dismantle the biggest opportunity of mine to go with you." Lucas was hurt. She could see that he was hurt, but pain did not make him right. "I thought you wanted a bigger life," he said. "I am living a big life. You're living a safe life. You mistake safe for small because you've never had to beg for it. That stopped him for a moment. But then he said, I fly in 3 weeks. I need to know if you're coming with me. That evening, Amelia asked him to come to the studio to talk. Not her apartment, not his place, not a restaurant where candles and wine could soften everything. Grant House Studio after hours smelled of paper, wood, old coffee, and rain. Streetlights reflected off the glass door bearing her name. Inside was Maya's desk with a photo of her daughter taped beside the monitor, Lily's room drawing pinned to the board, the loan documents in a folder, the opening day photo where Amelia and Maya stood under the slightly crooked sign, the studio key in Amelia's hand. Lucas walked in, looked around, and for the first time, Amelia wanted him to truly see this place not as a beautiful backdrop to her story, but as a living body. I'm choosing you, Lucas said after nearly an hour of arguing, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. I have this opportunity in New York, and I want you there. I'm not leaving you behind. Amelia stood beside Lily's drawing, her hand resting on the edge of the table. No, you're choosing a life and asking whether I'm willing to become the version of myself that fits inside it. He shook his head. You're acting like I want to destroy you. I'm not saying you want to. That's what makes this harder. Then what do you want me to do? Turn down New York? No. Do long distance forever? I don't know. I know. You want everything not to change. You want me still here, the studio's still here, your mother's still here, your employees still here, and me figuring out how to fit into every box your life already has. And you want me to throw away all my boxes so I can fit inside yours. Lucas went silent. Rain swept across the glass. Amelia continued, her voice lower now. You love me. I believe that. But you love me most when I'm the woman standing next to you at an exhibition, at the harbor, in your apartment, in your photographs. You don't love the whole system that allows me to stand there without collapsing. You call it fear, a cage, an emergency exit because it doesn't serve your story about freedom. Lucas looked at her as if she had turned his love into something ugly. I don't know how to love you if you don't come with me, he said. That hurt more than any accusation. Because it was true, and because it made clear the thing she feared most. That's what hurts me most, she replied. Not that you don't love me, but that your love does not know how to stay with me when I can't become the version of myself that is easy to carry. Lucas cried after that, quietly, his hand covering his face. Amelia did not hold him, not because she no longer cared, because she knew if she held him then, she would once again become the one comforting the pain of the person asking her to uproot herself. When Lucas left the studio, Amelia stayed alone until nearly midnight. Most of the lights were off. Only the desk lamp in the meeting area remained, and the rain outside the glass had softened but not stopped. She sat on the floor, her back against the fabric sample cabinet, looking at the blurred reflection of the sign in the glass, and for the first time allowed herself to acknowledge her own part without handing all the truth over to Lucas. He was not entirely wrong when he said she was afraid. She was afraid. She feared the new city, long-distance love, losing him, waking one day older inside the studio and wondering whether she had chosen safety over life. She had used work to avoid certain emotional questions. She had hidden behind deadlines, so she would not have to say what she needed. She had sometimes felt relief when Lucas traveled, because she did not have to face the tenderness that might demand she open herself wider. But Lucas was wrong to think the cure for her fear was to ask her to abandon the place that kept her standing. Her courage was not burning down the house to prove she was not afraid of fire. Her courage had been signing a lease when her account did not hold 3 months of expenses, hiring Maya before she was sure there would be clients, saying no to the firm that stole from her, staying near Ruth without turning that into a chain, building a place where people like Theo and Lily were seen as worthy. She opened an old email from the firm that had stolen her idea. Reread the line, "We appreciate your contributions, but leadership requires adaptability." Then looked around the studio. Adaptability. People always loved using beautiful words to ask women to melt into whatever shape someone else needed. She closed the laptop. In the dark, the studio did not make her feel healed. It made her feel the cost, but it was her cost, not one calculated in someone else's PDF. The final 3 weeks before Lucas's flight became a chain of rain, silence, messages written and deleted, short phone calls, and conversations with no exit left. Lucas's apartment was full of boxes, open suitcases, and a photograph of the two of them on the dresser. Amelia came to tell him her decision the night before his flight. Lucas had guessed, but guessing did not make it hurt less. He stood in the nearly empty apartment, his eyes red, a roll of packing tape in his hand like a meaningless object. "I thought you believed in us," he said. "I believe we were real. That isn't an answer. It's the only answer I have that isn't a lie." He laughed very softly, pained and bitter. "You're choosing work over love." Amelia felt that sentence fly toward her like something designed to strike her deepest guilt. "I'm not choosing the studio over you," she said. "I'm choosing not to become someone who has to abandon the studio in order to be loved by you." Lucas turned away. "The studio doesn't hold you at night." The sentence was more brutal because he said it in pain, not cruelty. Amelia felt tears rise, but she did not let them decide her answer. "No, but the studio doesn't ask me to disappear to deserve staying." He stepped closer. "I'm offering you a bigger life. You're offering me your life. So this is the end?" "No," Amelia said, her voice shaking but clear. "This is the first time I'm not calling keeping myself a betrayal." Lucas truly cried then. Not beautifully, not cinematically. He sat on the edge of the bed, both hands over his head, saying he did not know how to get on the plane if she did not come with him. Part of her wanted to kneel in front of him, to say they would find a way, to turn everything temporary so she would not have to watch love die in the room. But she stayed standing. She had learned that there were pains where if you ran to save the other person, you would be pulled under yourself. The next morning, while Lucas was at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, rain falling heavily against the glass roof, boarding announcements echoing through the polished halls, Amelia stood inside the studio holding Lily's room plan. His message appeared on her phone. "If you come now, we can still do this." If she came now, they could still do this. It was unfair because it turned all of love into one final scene, a race to the airport, a choice that had to be proven by speed. Amelia stood in the middle of the studio, her hands cold. She almost went, truly almost. She took her coat from the hook, grabbed her car keys, stepped toward the door. In her mind, she saw Lucas at the airport, suitcase beside him, eyes searching the crowd for her. She saw the version of herself running in, crying, him holding her, strangers looking, music swelling if life were a movie. And after that scene, what would come? A Brooklyn apartment without her name on it. Maya looking for another job. Ruth being arranged with a caregiver. Lily receiving another designer who did not know why that particular shade of purple mattered. Amelia waking in a new city beside the man she loved, and having to convince herself every morning that the emptiness inside her was freedom. Just then Maya walked in, her coat wet, coffee in hand, knowing nothing about the message. "Can you look over Lily's drawing before I send it to Theo?" she asked. That small question pulled Amelia back into the present. Not like a chain, like a hand placed on her shoulder. A real life needed her, not because she was trapped, but because she had chosen to create it. Amelia looked at the phone again. She typed, "I love you, but I'm not coming." She sent it. Lucas did not reply. His plane took off somewhere she could not see. But she heard the rain tapping the studio glass and felt another door closing inside her chest. Not loudly, not grandly, only so heavily that she had to place her hand on the edge of the table to stay upright. The weeks that followed offered no reward for choosing correctly. Amelia lost sleep, waking at 3 in the morning with the feeling that she had forgotten something important, only to remember that Lucas was no longer in Seattle. She smelled the trace of him still caught in the scarf behind the door, and cried in the laundry room so Maya would not see her red eyes the next morning. She opened old messages, reading lines he had sent from trips, looking at photographs of sunrise at the harbor, her hand holding a paper cup, the studio in afternoon light. Photographs so beautiful she almost hated him for having looked at the place with love and still not understood it. She took Ruth to appointments, sat in waiting rooms listening to her mother talk about the weather as if she did not know her daughter was breaking. And when Amelia finally burst into tears in the car, Ruth only placed a hand on the back of her neck and said, "I'm glad you didn't mistake pain for wrong." Nina helped her revise the studio, contract and negotiate better protective clauses in case she ever opened another branch or transferred part of management. Maya stayed, though Amelia had feared she would be angry. Maya even proposed expanding into accessible design after Lily's project, saying there were many families like Theo's who had no idea where to turn. Lily's room was completed at the end of summer, its walls a muted gray-purple, the window covered with light curtains, the bookshelves low enough for her hands, the turning space wide beside the bed. Lily came in and was silent for a long time, then said, "It doesn't look like a hospital." Theo turned his face away. Amelia stood in the doorway, her heart hurting because Lucas was not there to photograph that moment, then immediately felt she was being unfair to herself because that moment did not need Lucas as a witness to be real. 3 months later, he sent a photograph from New York, a rooftop overlooking red brick buildings, orange sunset in the sky with the message, "I wish you could see this." Amelia looked at the photo for a long time. She wished she could see it. That was true. She wished she could stand beside him without losing herself. She did not answer right away. That evening she wrote only, "It's beautiful." She did not add, "I miss you." She did not add, "I wish I were there." Even though both sentences were partly true, a person can learn not to place the whole truth into hands that do not know how to hold it. A year later, Grant House Studio opened on a lightly rainy morning, not so different from many other Seattle mornings. But Amelia remembered it because she had just wiped the sign on the glass door with a soft cloth, carefully enough that the words Grant House Studio shone in the gray light. Inside, there was a new desk for an intern, a photograph of Lily's completed room hanging on the wall not like an advertisement, but like a reminder of why the place existed. Maya was on the phone with a client about widening an entryway for a stroller, and the coffee pot in the small kitchen was bubbling. The studio had not turned Amelia into a perfectly happy person. There were nights when she still opened her phone and saw a photograph of Lucas in New York in a magazine, standing in a gallery, thinner, his hair longer, his eyes still sad in the way that had once made her want to touch him. There was an interview where he spoke about the courage to leave what no longer holds you. And Amelia had to put the phone down because she did not know whether the sentence was aimed at her, or whether she was still placing herself inside his story out of old habit. There were nights when she asked herself, what if? What if Brooklyn? What if a small apartment? What if waking beside him? What if the studio had been sold, and she had survived anyway? Those questions did not disappear. They simply stopped being a sentence passed against her. One morning, a postcard arrived from New York, the front showing a wet street in the rain, the back written in Lucas's handwriting. "I hope you're still building beautiful rooms." Amelia read it beside her desk. She did not cry. She did not smile very much. She placed the postcard in a drawer, not the trash, but not on her desk like something sacred either. She did not hate him. That made the wound colder. If she hated him, the story would be easier to tell. But Lucas had loved her truly. He simply could not love her whole life when that life did not move in the direction he had drawn. He had not betrayed her with another woman, had not broken her with crude words, had not taken her money, had not laughed at her dream. He had only loved a lighter version of Amelia, one with fewer responsibilities, easier to carry, and almost made her believe that version was the brave one. The first clients arrived at 9, a young couple wanting to remodel a small kitchen so an aging father could cook without standing too long. Amelia held the studio key, turned it in the lock, opened the door, and let the smell of rain enter with the sound of the city. Her hand still trembled slightly, the way it sometimes did when touching things that truly mattered. She no longer heard Lucas asking why she did not dare to live bigger. Or if she did, she had an answer now. She was living big, just not inside the frame he had drawn for her. Amelia had once thought the tragedy was having to choose between the man she loved and the life she had built. The real tragedy would have been choosing someone who did not understand why that life existed. She kept the studio, kept Seattle, kept Ruth, kept Maya, kept the clients who had trusted her, and kept herself. Her heart took a very long time to quiet, longer than she wanted to admit, and on some days it did not quiet at all, only lay still like rain behind glass. But every morning, when the key turned in the lock of Grant House Studio, she knew that some loves are not large enough to hold the whole of a person, and should never be allowed to call themselves everything.